Hello, and welcome to the Cat and Sam Show. We're here with Dr. Dan and Sam Beckinsale. I'd like to have Dr. Dan. Why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and why we're here?
Okay. So I'm a licensed psychologist in the state of Texas. I've been working with individuals with personality disorders for over the last 20 years. And I tend to focus on individuals that fall into the cluster B category. That's your antisocial personality disorder, narcissistic personality disorder, borderline personality disorder, and histrionic personality disorder. I have a private practice here in Texas, but I work with folks in particular states all throughout the country. I also have an active YouTube channel as well, and several books that I've written, not only for mental health providers, but also for clients as well. And the goal of my material is to bring some reality and research-based information to not only those that are diagnosed with a personality disorder, but also I think to the population in general, because I think that the more we learn about it, the more we actually know and understand it, the better we're able to manage it, deal with it, and interact with it. And I think that that's where our interests align. Certainly when we talk about, domestic violence and other types of issues that we'll talk about today.
Yeah, it's one of the things that intrigued me is one of your videos talking about the stuff that you do with your clients comparative to other people in the mental health, and we won't go into that, but because I didn't ask you. But I think that that's a really good point, that a lot of people are still working in old ideologies and not trying new things. And that's one of the reasons I love being able to ask you to come on, and that you've agreed to come on. So we'll start off right away with the question. Do you want to ask him a question, Sam?
I do. I mean, one of the areas with in domestic violence and abuse is, one of the questions I suppose that we ask is, do perpetrators know what they're doing? Do they have often something like antisocial personality disorder will be mentioned? So what would you like the domestic violence community to know about personality disorders, and maybe especially around the area of what's of interest for me is it being used as an excuse sometimes for behaviour. So if you were able to, if we were able to sort of have a conversation around that of, like, do they know what they're doing? Or I think it's very difficult for people who've experienced domestic abuse to not look for an excuse for it and say, well, they don't know what they're doing and they're lovely people. And that can be very dangerous in the dynamic in terms of repeat going back. But also then them not being held to account for their behaviour as well, because they may well be, have a personality disorder. Yeah. So,
Sure. And I think, first I think it's important to break apart whether it's a reason or whether it is an excuse. And I think when we talk about excuse, then we'll talk about like rationalizations for inappropriate behavior, for violence, other types of issues there. If we're talking about a reason, then I think, what we're talking about, so are individuals that fall into that personality disorder category, so are they at a higher likelihood to engage in partner violence or parental alienation or other types of issues where they harm others? And I think, absolutely, I think that some certainly are. And I think certainly your individuals along the antisocial spectrum, I think are at a high likelihood to engage in more violence. And I think because they spend more time with their partners or with individuals that they're in relationships with, I think that does increase the likelihood and probability of that violence. Also, they tend to be closer depending on the severity of the antisocial personality disorder. So that emotional connection. Psychopaths don't really emotionally connect. Sociopaths do. Individuals that are just antisocial personality. So we're looking at three different levels, so to speak. So your most extreme would be your psychopath. Second to that would be your sociopath. So they have some social skills. Usually they're good at talking people into things. That's where I think that those individuals that are more sociopathic are more likely to certainly engage in violence, and then they can talk their way out of it. That way they can say, well, they get the individual who's the recipient of the violence to then believe that, well, you're right, I shouldn't have done A, B, and C, so that's why you did it. Whereas really, from my perspective, professional and personal, I think that there's never a reason to touch someone else if they're not agreeable to it. So certainly, those individuals, of course, feel like that their immediate needs, which come across, of course, as violence, like we're talking about today, they feel like that they are justified in doing that. That's where that excuse comes in. And then your antisocial is kind of the low end of that spectrum that we're talking about. Your antisocial personality disordered individuals, just they're rule breakers. They a lot of theft, a lot of manipulation, a lot of recklessness, but they don't add that complexity that you see typically in your psychopath or your sociopath. So. But if we lump them all together, I think that group is probably the highest likelihood. Probably second to that would probably be your narcissistic personality disordered individuals. And I think that those individuals, the reason why they are at a higher likelihood to engage in interpersonal violence, domestic violence, is usually because they incur what's called a narcissistic wound. And that narcissistic wound could be they're in a relationship. The partner realizes there's no growth in the relationship. It's not going anywhere. The relationship seems to only feed the ego of the narcissist. So the partner then decides, I think I'm done. I think, I'm going to get out. But the narcissist sees their partner as property. Now we can differentiate that from your antisocial spectrum individual who then ultimately their partner isn't property. Their partner is more of, what can I get out of you? So if you want to leave, as long as I get everything I want, I don't care. But the narcissist, their ego, their sense of self becomes wrapped up with that individual, even though they treat them poorly and they treat them as though they're only an object to reinforce their own sense of self and ego and self-esteem, that if you lose that person, that hits them at their core, which is typically full of self-doubt, fear, inferiority, guilt, rejection fears in some cases. So that's where a lot of times the violence comes from. Interestingly, research was done probably about 15, 20 years ago, and they looked at the different personality disorders, and what they found that the narcissist is actually most likely to commit murder, even more than the antisocial personality disorder. But if you look at it through the lens of what I just described, which is that the loss of that partner or the individual that incurs that narcissistic wound, whether it's a partner, it could be a therapist, it could be, a boss, whoever it may be, whoever incurs that narcissistic wound, they have to then be eradicated. And it's not always murder, which is an extreme act, but it can sometimes be like a financial. It can be social. Now, a lot with social media, you really see these personality disorders coming out on the internet. In my last research-based book, I talked about how these different personality disorders manifest online. And when we talk about domestic violence, I wonder if you've looked at or reviewed just how that the social media component, which is very much, as I see it, it's not physical violence, but it's certainly mental, emotional, psychological violence, I think, towards others. And your narcissistic spectrum individuals that are real high likelihood to engage.
Well,
in that.
that's interesting. So in the UK, in terms of a law, that online and media abuse is absolutely being seen front and center in with coercive and controlling behaviour and abuse. Over here, we call it domestic abuse to include the physical violence as well as the non-direct physical violence, but certainly there is a general understanding here as well, as even though we don't use the word violence, domestic violence, it is all violence. I mean, some people even say terrorism, but the social media stuff, and I suppose it's an extension, isn't it, of the isolation and the destruction of the society around their target. And online and social media is actually just a really easy and accessible way to do that now, isn't it? Like,
Absolutely it is.
And what's the name of your book?
And those
sorry, Kat. What's the name of your book that you were just saying, your online, the research?
Oh, yeah. Well, I have visual aids.
Oh, marvelous!
But yeah, no. So it's right here. This is the one. So the Antisocial Narcissistic Borderline Personality Disorder, and it is a research based book. So I like to tell folks that. But there is a section on there that does talk about those online behaviors, and I think a lot of times many mental health providers, they're not asking about online behaviors, and we're missing a huge component of our life. And, I've been doing this for 20 years. When I started, I mean, there was no social media, but I always try to get a sense of my clients or people that I'm working with or doing consultations or assessments with. What is their online behavior? What are they doing? What kind of connections do they make? And particularly for individuals that are 25 years and under, we have to be seeing what they're doing online, and I think that this can directly relate to a lot of domestic violence, certainly parental alienation, other types of stress as well, which is because there's a degree of social awkwardness, I think, with those. And I'm not saying all, of course, right? But we see this preponderance of social awkwardness and this sense of hesitancy to get into physical relationships. And physical relationships doesn't mean intimate or sexual. What it means is that we're in the same room together. We're in the same coffee shop together. And like we're having a discussion and an interaction. And what you find is that there's such a low frustration tolerance and a tendency to dismiss other individuals that don't agree with 100% of how I see the world. That's low frustration tolerance. That's low tolerance of someone else having a different perspective. What that means is we're all in our bubbles. So if we're in bubbles and we don't tolerate other people's behavior, then we're getting into temperament. What is our temperament? How much of that difference do we tolerate? Right? And could that end up in physical violence? Could that end up in other types of particularly egregious behaviors? Absolutely. And I think impaired empathy. And there's even a new type of empathy, which is called online empathy. And very few people seem to have online empathy.
Well, it's interesting because they can hide behind a computer and they can act like anything they want to act like, and they can leave anytime they want. That's right. I think your research is spot on. I'm wondering about the blends when we blend personality disorders where they bleed into other personalities, so they don't necessarily. And I'm not talking about diagnosis, but I'm talking about in the general public when we're looking at somebody and they're bleeding with the different. When you look up on what is it called, the DSMs, when it shows you the different personalities, it's just, that's used as a diagnostic tool for the mental health department or the mental health people. It's not for the public, but
it is now.
Yeah,
online.
It's online. So I get a lot of people that are looking. Oh yeah, no, yeah, a lot of self-diagnosis, a lot.
Yeah, I just think it's hard because you get a lot of people doing a lot of things and saying a lot of things that aren't based in anything other than somebody said.
Opinion.
Right.
Yeah, opinion is the new science. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point to make, and I like that you're driving that. I just know that some of those personality disorders blend together, and it's hard to decipher, you know, where
Well,
that's
and
coming
then I
from.
think, to really to bring that, into perspective with what we're talking about today, is that I think that what happens is that, because of this generalized opinion, which is then presumed to be fact because so many people may share or have partial or parts of that opinion. So I think what happens is you have abusive partners who not only, are gaslighting, they're the recipient of the abuse. And the reason why I'm not using the word victim is because sometimes when I talk to individuals, they don't like that term. So I'm just trying to find a suitable term that you guys
I think that's a good term. I mean, Sam found one this weekend last week that was Victor.
Yes, it's somebody
because
who
they're
calls
coming
herself a victor.
over it.
She's a mixture of, so over here it's either victim, survivor, or victim, survivor hyphenated. So she called herself a victor, this combination of them both.
Okay.
I quite like target.
But, it's
somebody else, likes,
Yeah.
but,
it's all biases.
It's all biases, but certainly from a police point of view, isn't it? It's the
Sure.
yeah. We could talk about that all day.
And I guess I would.
Oh,
Right.
sure. Oh, sure. Absolutely. Well, I just want to make sure, that I'm staying consistent with the term that you guys like. But ultimately, so what happens is that I think that you have the abusive, the abuser, who then as I was mentioning, who gaslights, the recipient, and they get indoctrinated to it. So human beings are adaptive. So if you look at it, and I'm not a smoker, but I think smoking is a great example of a bad relationship, which is that, it first starts and you cough a little bit, I mean, your body your body doesn't want the smoke. It's bad. But if you keep forcing it, your body is going to adapt to it. Even something that is unhealthy, even something that increases the probability that it will end itself, right? With cancer, whatever may come out of it. But so relationships are the same way. And sometimes, a lot of those early patterns, they come out of certainly family relationships. They come out of, friendships. They come out of a lot of different patterns that we learn very early. And like with my clients, we're always working on what are those internalized patterns of what we perceive to be acceptability, right? And what is unacceptable. And it's interesting, and I'm in no way saying that individuals who are victors, are saying, oh, well, yeah, this is a great relationship. I know I'm getting hit or abused or, physical, emotional, sexual abuse. I'm in no way saying that, just to clarify. But what I am saying is that there is a part of us that says this fits our pattern. And it's interesting to see how that happens, because a lot of times, and this is my perspective, and be interesting to know if both of you have seen this as well, is that you see individuals that go from abusive relationship to abusive relationship to abusive relationship. And that serial relationship pattern, from my perspective in working with someone, is because it goes to that attachment, that attachment pattern, and it goes to that internalized pattern of understanding of what relationships are. And the best way that I describe it with my clients is Christmas morning. And Christmas morning is when we're talking about like identifying partners, learning different partner traits or partner interests, is that we go downstairs, right? Or maybe wherever your Christmas stuff is. And then you go there, right? And you've got these beautiful packages, right? One is silver, one is blue, and one is red. So you go over to the silver one and you tear it open and you're super excited to see it. And lo and behold, it is any toy you want, right? We'll just say Cabbage Patch doll, right? I don't know. Why not? Right? So you open up, it's a Cabbage Patch doll. It's this Cabbage Patch doll. Okay. So then you're like, oh, this is really great. I can't wait to see what's in the next one. You go over to the blue one and you tear open that. And when you tear it open, it's the same Cabbage Patch doll. And then you go to the red one and you tear it open. Well, I got two Cabbage Patch dolls. That's weird. Let's see what's in this one. And you tear it open, and it is another Cabbage Patch doll. that is the pattern, because the outside looks different, right? The outside, but there are components that we hone in on. There are things that we connect to. Sometimes they're overt and sometimes they are covert. And I think that working with my clients that certainly do have tendencies of getting into very violent relationships, we have to go to those patterns. And, you know, I remember a client I had years and years ago, and, you know, we were working on her partner patterns and her representations of others and connecting to others and things like that. And so then she met this other guy, and, you know, she left the abusive guy and she went with this other guy, and he was very attentive to her. He took her places like nice restaurants, things like that. I think they went to Paris or Italy or something like that, you know. And I was like, wow, what a great trip. It sounds really cool. What's that?
Red flag.
Yep. Yeah. Well, actually, interestingly, he was actually very nice.
Okay.
And what happened is, yeah. See, sometimes people are just nice, but what happened was that she came back and she said, "Oh, I broke up with him." And I was like, well, why is that? He seems so nice. She goes, well, she's like, you know, I would needle him if you know what I mean by that. So it's kind of like, you know, poking people. And she said, and he would just take it. And she said, he's a coward. And I said, well, she's like, there's nothing there. And I said, well, what? Because she had a long string of serial relationships. And I said, well, where are you now? Thinking, oh, maybe she's single. This is great. Nope. She went right back to the abusive boyfriend. And I said, well, you went back to him. What drove you back? She said, it's the passion. It's the passion that drove me back. And that really, like, as her psychologist, I mean, you know, of course, you know, we had to bring that to the forefront and say, you know, we have to define what passion is. We have to define what that connection is. But it's going underneath what that is, and her sense of value too. That, you know, and all of those components. I mean, we could talk about just her case forever. But what I can tell you is after several years of working together, though, we were able to change that pattern. We were able to get her to see relationships different, and no one touches her without permission. And she is just an incredibly powerful person. And I'm not saying she wasn't before, because she's very much a victor, as you described. But she embraces her sense of self and her choices. So it was just amazing.
And
growth.
that is absolutely fantastic that she's come through that to the other side. And what I find interesting, because there's a lot of, again, over here, a lot of victim blaming. So it's like, how did you let that happen? And about people who go back time and again. But that sort of first time it happened. So, for instance, with me, it was because I was concentrating on the physical violence. I believed a lot of the myths around domestic abuse and violence. So I ended up on this sort of hamster wheel, where it was psychological, emotional, financial, all of those other abuses and violences. But it took me a long time to get out, because it was like, once I'd started on the journey, because there was never that fist. If there'd been that fist, it out the door, wouldn't you know, his pants would have been on fire. He'd been out so quick. So it's that getting caught up in that. And for me, once is enough, frankly. But the questioning that we do of ourselves, and quite often victims are victors, or the targets of themselves, accused of all, and it is very much an accusation in this dynamic, of having personality disorders, of being mentally unstable, and very often borderline personality disorder, when they're actually quite, there's a trauma, you know, is it PTSD? Is it borderline? Is it her fault? Has she, where is her role? And what's interesting is one of the other things that we've been told is don't ever go to couples counselling together, because that then reinforces the dynamic that somebody is abusing you, creating a mental and emotional disturbance in you, and an understandable one at that. But then you are labelled with a disorder, and it somehow all becomes your fault. So I'd just be interested in what you think from that.
Yeah,
point of view.
and I think the one thing, yeah, definitely, and I think, you know, when you mentioned something interesting, don't go to couples therapy together. Then I would always say, how are you doing couples therapy?
That's just my
because
English. It's just like don't go to couples therapy.
Yeah.
Sorry,
but except believe it or not, many mental health providers say they're doing couples therapy without the couple in the room. So you have one person, you know, one of the individuals who's in the relationship in the room. And one of the things, you know, when I work with individuals that are partners of individuals along the narcissistic spectrum, narcissistic personality spectrum, I always say, well, I can only work with the person in the room. And I think, you know, it's so important, but there are many individuals out there who are saying, well, I mean, you know, well, we're doing couples therapy, but only he or she is showing up. Like, well, then that's not couples therapy. But I think, and I think that you do have to change that dynamic. And I think there's a lot of, Sam, everything you just said, I mean, absolutely. I'm right in line with that, because I think a lot of individuals feel that they're in relationships that they'll put up with a lot of psychological, emotional, financial abuse. Well, it's not like he hits me. Well, yeah, I mean, I think that, you know, as a psychologist, you know, you can put that in a particular framework, but as a person, I mean, it hurts. I mean, because a lot of times it goes to that Christmas morning. And I mean, no way saying that it's that individual's fault or anything. I don't really believe in fault. I think that that's a big waste of time. And I think that blaming people is a big waste of time, at least in my field, because I think it's about, okay, it's identifying the issues that are present and how do we change that? My job is to give my clients what they want. Right? Which is usually, no one has ever come in and said, can you make my relationship worse? Can you make my personality worse? No one's ever said that. Not yet. You know?
Right. But I think, you know, it falls into this mutual respect. So, I mean, that's that's the commonality that I've been told. And I believe it to be true is I can't go in and have couples counseling with somebody who doesn't have mutual respect for me and expect, I mean, I think somebody that is very educated and very intuitive as to what we are bringing to the table, and a lot of counselors won't even take people in that have those kinds of personalities disorders into couples counseling because they don't even want to get into the middle of that junk. And so I think I was always told you work on yourself and then they work on themselves. And then if you can come back together in a different form, then that's okay. And that's what I've always said, because I think it's dangerous for people to go into, and then the counselor gets conned because they don't have enough thought process or understanding of abuse or domestic violence.
Sure, absolutely. And I think, you know, interestingly, I think that a lot of people, maybe they read online and like, oh, you know, my partner's a narcissist, or, you know, my partner has borderline personality disorder, or, you know, whatever it may be. And you brought up borderline personality disorder, and, you know, the research actually doesn't show that individuals with BPD are at a higher likelihood to perpetrate domestic violence. And I know that's probably one of the beliefs, you know, out there as well. A video that I released today talked about intimacy and BPD. And I had to make sure that I added in infidelity in the video, because I knew that was going to be a question, because the research doesn't show that individuals with BPD are a higher likelihood to cheat on their partner. But I think that where some of the complexity comes from and the misunderstanding of a lot of these disorders is not only Hollywood and social media and all that, but that is bled into, just like we talked about a moment ago, is that opinion becomes the new science. So for BPD, one of the things that I work to destigmatize it, that people only, the sort of the understanding of BPD is only the upper 3%. That's the extreme form. So if someone says, oh, I have BPD, you imagine they're all cutters and they're all, physically aggressive, and, that they're melting down at any moment they don't get exactly what they need or think that they want, and it becomes so confusing. And I think that upper 3% is certainly at a higher likelihood to victimize their partners, but they also victimize themselves, and so on and so forth, so on and so forth. But that means we've got 97% of individuals who fall along that spectrum that don't have that high of a likelihood. And interestingly, in the way when I teach other mental health providers about BPD, I like to say, you probably have someone who has BPD in your life, and they're right in that 50%, the meaty part of that normal curve, right? And, they're probably fun to hang out with. They're interesting to hang out with. When they encounter stress, tends to be overwhelming. It's hard for them to put themselves back together sometimes. They need a little patience. They're at a higher likelihood for addictions, drugs, sex addiction, alcohol, gambling, other types of issues like that. And maybe they get wrapped up in that. That's at 50%. We go to that top 3%. Those are the ones that are stalking you, that are, smashing your windows, that are coming at you with weapons or bats or, things like that. A lot where law enforcement, I think, is certainly pulled in to those instances. That's the upper 3%. Of your
and just to clarify, that upper 3% that you're talking about is in the personality disorder line, or in just borderline personality disorder?
No, well, so I was talking specifically about BPD, but
Okay.
I think that now you're narcissist. I don't think that. I think narcissism has just become massively misunderstood, and the term has become colloquial. So a lot like, psychopath, right? I mean, a psychopath, to me, if you ever hear me identify someone as a psychopath, that means that they are clinically identified as a psychopath, right? Like with my students, I tell my students, part of getting into this field means that the luxury of the colloquial use of our clinical terms is gone. You can't say, oh, like someone who is very moody, you can't say, man, they're borderline or they're bipolar. You've lost that right, in my opinion. You'll never hear me say anything like that colloquially, because the people that I talk to, they're going to be like, oh, well, he knows. So he's no. I don't, you got to be really careful.
Yeah, you can't blur that line
I think
with your profession.
I'm sorry?
I just said I don't think you can blur that line with professional. That's
right. Oh, yeah. But it happens all the time, the time. And I think that when we talk about narcissism and violence towards others, partner violence, domestic violence, I think that isn't your upper 3%. I think that is probably a little higher. That's probably your more extreme, maybe even high moderate, because we're talking about that spectrum, that severity spectrum. I think they're much higher likelihood again. And I think for your antisocial, depending on the complexity of the issue, which is the pathology, how much or the degree of antisocial traits are present, things like that. They are abusive because of their low frustration tolerance, and that they don't really care. They don't really connect so much to others. But also, you're taking what I want, and if you take what I want, I'm going to fight you to get it back, and I'm going to kill you to get it back. Well, that's okay. I'm okay with that. Yeah, so it's very different. And you mentioned earlier, when we step outside the DSM, when we step outside into more of the general population, those that may not fit into that category, we end up, it's real murky. And I work with a lot of people that just have personality disorder traits. The full disorders are actually very rare. And those traits are much easier to treat. But again, depending on which traits, you're talking about a higher likelihood of taking advantage of others, manipulating others, harming others, things
I
like
find
that.
it absolutely... sorry, Kat, go on.
Go
I
ahead,
was just going
Sam.
to say, I find it absolutely fascinating what you've just said about BPD, because so many victims of abuse are accused of, that meltdown, that this extreme reaction as a reaction to the abuse, are then labelled and often diagnosed with BPD, and it's just like and labelled an abuser. Oh, well, look, she's the abuser. Or he or she, but they are the one that's the issue, because look how badly they behave. Look how uncontrolled they are in their emotions and stuff. Look how overwhelmed they are by life. But it's because of the experience that they've had that's created it. You take the experience away, and they tend to not be like that anymore. So either that's a miracle cure for for borderline personality, or that wasn't what was wrong with them in the first place. It's more likely PTSD or whatever other
yeah, well, you guys have complex PTSD over there. Yeah. So and there's so much overlap between complex PTSD and BPD
really
as well. Oh yeah. Now I'm only because we're just talking about sort of prevalence when we talk about complex PTSD and we talk about BPD. With complex PTSD, you're talking about an internalization of the abuse that you are then saying, because I encountered this abuse, I am broken. Whereas your individual with BPD says, well, I'm broken. They don't necessarily associate it to the abusive instance or the trauma. It's not always abuse. There's various types of trauma, but with the trauma. So that's one of those distinguishers. But I think that, you can go all the way back with what you were saying. If you go all the way back to, Harlow's monkeys, right? He did the attachment research with monkeys, and you had the cloth mother monkey and you had the wire mother, and the cloth mother, when you frightened the rhesus monkey and you would poke this is in the 50s, so they were able to poke and hurt the monkeys rather disgustingly, but they did it, and you would see that the rhesus monkey would run to the cloth mother. Interestingly, when the wire mother, when you would poke that rhesus monkey, he became violent, became aggressive. It had almost like panic attacks, panic-like behavior, very, very generalized. Obviously, they don't have the same frontal lobe that we do, but and you see that. So it's always, it's always painful to hear that somebody in an abusive relationship or abusive circumstance, that they are then getting diagnosed with a disorder while they're in that relationship. I mean, it's like, I see people all the time that are diagnosed with bipolar disorder while they're high on, methamphetamine. And I'm like, yeah, that's not the disorder. That means you act bipolar when you're on meth. Don't do meth and let's see what happens, so yeah.
Well, we can do it again. We'd love to have you on all the time.
Dr. Dan, I could talk to you all night. I'm sure we could. It's absolutely fantastic to see you. But please, please, please.
Fly me over to the UK.
Absolutely.
We'll fly you over.
Yes, we'll all go.
We'll all go, that's right.
But
stay at Sammy's.
Stay at mine, absolutely. But please, would you come back on again, and can we carry on? Because I've just enjoyed this so much, and we hope that you have too, and that everybody watching it enjoys it and gets. There's all sorts of things I'm going to go and look at now, and I'm definitely going to get your book as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was going to say, Sammy's going to get your book, and we're going to devour it, and then we'll talk about it.
Thank you.
And then we'll bring you back on.
And one of the big issues is actually, so a lot of folks in England and UK. So my book on complex borderline personality disorder, we talk about, PTSD, complex PTSD, and BPD. And that is, and I don't want to say it's a problem or issue because I don't want to overstep. Then I can only say from my experience in working with individuals, having contact with individuals that live in the UK, have said there's so much confusion about BPD and complex PTSD and PTSD. And that's why, in writing that particular chapter, I really wanted to write to those in the UK, in who are outside the US. Not that US doesn't have their own set of confusion and issues with those diagnoses, but it seems to be, I don't want to say more prevalent, but maybe it's just brought up to me more often that folks will write me from that part of the world and say, so I have a psychologist who says this and this, but it doesn't seem to make sense when you talk about this and this, and there's so much confusion, even though there's so much diagnostic confusion to begin with. But I think when you talk about violence and recipients of violence and victors of violence, I think that just that it always kind of hurts my heart a little bit to think that somebody's in this abusive relationship and they're trying to get out, and it's so much. It always brings me back to the rhesus monkeys, and we outlaw that behavior, for rhesus monkeys, but we don't blame the monkey for it, right? But here we blame the victim for it. And
yeah, exactly.
Wow.
And that's why I'm so glad you've been willing to come on, is because it is, it's a big problem. I'm going to end it with this, and Sam will have her bit, but did you have any little thought about the Tubi commercial and how there was 15 seconds of all this violence that was happening in the domestic violence, or are you not aware?
I am not aware. I don't
So
watch too much TV.
Yeah, me neither. But there was a Super Bowl commercial. Tubi had the sportscasters on, and then it kind of clicked down as if somebody was using the remote. And there was a girl that wrote in Reddit about how her husband or her boyfriend called her all kinds of names and punched a hole in the wall. And then when she went home, her parents told her, she went home to get away from him, and they said, "Oh, it was just a commercial." You had people throwing drinks on wait staff at bars and stuff. I'll send you the link.
Oh my God. Yeah.
But it was my point of even bringing it up was just that 15 seconds of it being violent, and then it went back to normal.
Yeah.
And,
and
it wasn't spoken about, right?
Me? No. I'm not familiar with it.
No, I know, but what I'm saying, it's very, it's like a little window in domestic violence. It's that, something happens and it's big, and then it's like nobody wants to talk about it.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And then, it goes back to what we were discussing earlier about that low frustration tolerance, that social awkwardness, and then also this expectations of relationships, right? That your perfect relationship, you never argue, you never have sexual problems, everybody shows up on time, it's like, that's not the world we live in, but that becomes the comparison. And for a lot of my clients, that they're like, yeah, but we argue. Yeah, everybody argues, yeah. I mean, my wife, she's a psychologist as well. And, we argue. I mean, we've learned to tame it, like we'll argue maybe a minute, maybe two, but then we wrap it up. We've been together for 22 years. We kind of understand our ins and outs. You can imagine two psychologists.
I can imagine that
breaking apart. Yeah. But but absolutely. I mean, I think that we're also going against this comparison image and idea that is so unrealistic. And relationships are like plants. You don't water, you don't feed it, you don't talk to it. It will perish.
And that brings back the online stuff that you were talking about as well. Honestly, you're an absolute joy to talk to, and I think
I second that.
The information that you've given, will go off and find even more, but I think people will. It'll be such a relief for an awful lot of people to know that they're not alone. That's why we do this, to talk and share. So thank you so much, Dr. Dan. Please.
Well, you're so very welcome, and thank you for saying that. I would absolutely love to. That would be wonderful. And thank you both. And I will tell you both that the work you're doing is something that I think is very, very important. And it's something that even, when I started school, I worked with kids in a domestic violence shelter. And I remember every single one of those kids' faces. And, they were just... They were all victors. They were. And so thank you so much for saying it. It means a lot, and it's part of the passion of what I do and the importance, I think, of what I do. Thank you.
Thank you.